It begins with a date no one was meant to notice. A moment buried beneath headlines of rockets, neural implants, and billion-dollar breakthroughs, yet whispered about in the corners of the internet, where obsession thrives and theories multiply like sparks in the dark. Because somewhere between power and genius, between ambition and secrecy, a story unfolded that no one can fully explain. A story involving Elon Musk, one of the most scrutinized men on the planet, and Sivan Zilis, the brilliant, fiercely private executive whose mind helped shape some of the most advanced AI systems of our time. Two lives intersecting behind closed doors. Two timelines aligning a little too precisely. Two decisions that changed everything, yet left the world with only fragments, clues, and questions. Was it strategy? Was it necessity? Or was it something the public was never meant to decode? There are dates that appear ordinary until you realize what they connect. There are choices that seem logical until you trace the shadows they cast. And there is one moment, quiet, concealed, and still unexplained, that has ignited a storm of speculation. A moment that forces us to ask, where does professional partnership end, and where does something deeper begin? Tonight, we trace the clues. We follow the timelines. We unravel the secrecy. And what we find may reveal far more than anyone expected. The story truly begins long before anyone started asking questions, long before online threads spiraled into speculation, and timelines were dissected like evidence on a table. It begins in silence because all stories involving power, technology, and extraordinary ambition usually do. Elon Musk was already a figure stretched between worlds, rockets in one hand, artificial intelligence in the other, a man moving at a velocity few could track, let alone understand. Every decision he made shifted markets, redirected industries, or reshaped the future itself. But behind that impossible pace, something else was happening, something quieter, almost invisible. The assembling of minds, the construction of teams, the gathering of people who could help build visions too large for any one person to carry. And within that circle of thinkers, one name kept appearing, Sivan Zilis. Her presence wasn't loud, nor was it marketed. It didn't need to be. Her reputation in artificial intelligence moved ahead of her, methodical, sharp, intensely focused. She was the kind of mind that didn't chase the spotlight. She built the engines behind it. Their worlds met at the crossroads of innovation, where the boundary between possibility and impossibility blurs. Professional, strategic, intentional. But to outsiders looking in, outsiders who only saw pieces, announcements, timestamps, it was a convergence that invited more questions than answers. Because true genius rarely unfolds in public view. It grows in meeting rooms no one reports on. It forms during decisions not recorded in headlines. It's shaped by late-night problem-solving, relentless ambition, and the gravity that pulls exceptional people toward each other's orbit. Yet the more their professional paths intertwined, the more the public began to search for meaning in the spaces between the facts. People traced patterns, built theories, and stitched together narratives from fragments, corporate decisions, AI initiatives, overlapping timelines. Not because the truth was known, but because the unknown creates a vacuum the world can't resist filling. And somewhere inside that vacuum lay the date that changed everything. A date that appeared ordinary until it didn't. A date that would ignite debates, spark conspiracy videos, and blur the line between logic and curiosity. But before we reach that moment, before the questions intensified, we must understand the environment that made it possible. Because nothing about this story makes sense until the world around it does. And when that world comes into focus, the shadows begin to move. To understand the tension that would soon surround their names, one must first understand the strange gravity of proximity, how two people working within the same storm of innovation can appear, from the outside, to be part of something far more mysterious than what the public can confirm. In the world of advanced technology, closeness is not uncommon. Breakthroughs rarely emerge from solitary minds. They are born from clusters of intellect, compressed into high-pressure environments where ideas collide and evolve. It was in this crucible that Elon Musk and Sivan Zilis operated parallel forces, navigating the same frontier of artificial intelligence, each pushing toward futures the world wasn't yet ready to comprehend. But to observers on the outside, proximity is never just proximity. It becomes pattern. Pattern becomes narrative. And narrative becomes fuel. The digital age has a way of magnifying whatever sits behind glass. A single connection becomes a thread becomes a theory, And eventually, the theories develop a life of their own, growing louder than the facts they were built upon. Public fascination sharpened because both individuals moved through the world with an unusual level of intensity. Musk-driven, unpredictable, commanding the attention of millions with every statement. Zillus precise, guarded, and deeply aligned with the mission of building safe and powerful AI, their shared professional vision only deepened the curiosity surrounding them. To many, their synergy looked less like coincidence and more like inevitability. Still, the questions didn't erupt overnight. They simmered quietly, waiting for a catalyst, a detail, a moment, a date that would pull everything into a sharper, more suspicious focus. Yet before that catalyst arrived, something deeper and far less visible was taking shape. Their professional alignment was accelerating, projects expanded, responsibilities overlapped, and every move was scrutinized by a public conditioned to find meaning in every shift, every headline, every unexplained silence. Online discussions grew more elaborate. Analysts dissected organizational charts, comparing them like blueprints. Commentators speculated about influence, intention, and hidden dynamics. None of them knew the truth. None of them claimed certainty. But certainty wasn't what people were searching for. They wanted mystery. They wanted tension. They wanted a story. And without realizing it, the story was already forming, shaped, not by what was known, but by what wasn't. Because sometimes the most compelling narratives emerge, not from revelations, but from the spaces where answers refuse to exist. And in those spaces, the first real question begins to take shape. Timelines are supposed to offer clarity. They are meant to anchor events in certainty, to show the sequence of what happened, when it happened, and how each moment shaped the next. But in this story, the timeline did the opposite. Instead of answers, it created distortion. Instead of order, it produced unease. Because when people began tracing the dates surrounding Musk and Zillus, not their private lives but the publicly visible milestones, something strange happened. The more the public tried to map the connections, the more the lines seemed to blur. There were career movements that aligned too neatly, announcements that surfaced too close together, decisions that felt synchronized, yet unexplained. Nothing shocking on its own, nothing that broke the pattern of normal corporate evolution. But in the collective mind of the internet, scattered dots invite connection. And once people begin connecting dots, they rarely stop. The world watched as two professional trajectories moved in ways that felt almost choreographed, advancing toward the same technological horizon, echoing the same mission, shaped by the same relentless pursuit of innovation. It felt intentional, purposeful, coordinated, and yet, none of it revealed the one thing everyone wanted to know. Instead, the timeline offered only implications, glimmers, shadows. Enough to provoke curiosity, but never enough to satisfy it. The uncertainty created a tension that grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a quiet hum beneath the surface. Online forums transformed into investigation boards. Articles speculated with cautious wording. Commentators asked questions nobody could conclusively answer. Theories multiplied, each one more elaborate than the last. Some suggested strategic alignment. Others proposed mutual ambition. A few whispered about motives that lay far beyond professional necessity. But the truth remained buried, hidden beneath layers of privacy, corporate formality, and the simple fact that not all stories exist for the public to unravel. Still, there was something about the rhythm of the events, something about the way they unfolded that felt like a coded message waiting to be interpreted. A message the public was certain they could decipher if they just looked closely enough. And then, in the midst of this swirl of speculation, came the moment that changed everything. The moment that turned questions into obsession and timelines into potential clues. A moment that didn't answer anything, but made people believe that answers were within reach. And that moment is where the mystery deepens. Every mystery has a turning point. One moment when curiosity shifts into fixation, when observers stop asking casual questions and begin searching with sharper eyes. In this story, that turning point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't even fully understood. It was simply a date. A date that appeared in public records, corporate timelines, and governmental filings, ordinary documents that most people never read. But once discovered, it became the center of gravity around which all speculation orbited. To outsiders, this date seemed to sit slightly out of place. Not suspicious, not incriminating, just curious. It marked a decision that aligned with key moments in Musk's expanding universe of projects. It coincided with Zillus' growing influence in high-level AI initiatives. It sat at the crossroads of two powerful trajectories, like a hinge connecting chapters that weren't meant to be linked so tightly. The public didn't know what the date meant, they only knew it felt significant. And feeling was enough. Internet threads dissected it with forensic intensity. Commentators replayed it through layers of interpretation. Videos emerged, each promising to finally explain the truth, yet offering nothing but elaborate theory crafted from publicly visible fragments. Some called it strategic timing, some called it coincidence, and others suggested it was a clue to a larger, hidden context, one the world wasn't supposed to see. But the truth is simpler and more unsettling. A date becomes powerful not because of what it proves, but because of what it suggests. And once the date was uncovered, the narrative surrounding Musk and Zillus shifted. What had been broad speculation now narrowed into something more pointed, more obsessive. People began searching backward and forward, re-examining every related milestone with newfound suspicion, as if the entire story could be decoded through context alone. The more the public searched, the more they believed there must be something to find. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Certainty dissolved into possibility. Possibility hardened into theory. And slowly, the conversation drifted away from what was known and deep into the realm of what might exist behind the curtain. Because once a single moment becomes a mystery, everything around it becomes a clue. And somewhere in those clues, the public believed, lay the key to understanding the true nature of their connection, professional, strategic, or something the world could only guess at. But the story doesn't stop at one date. It never does. Because, soon after, the silence surrounding that moment grew even louder, and silence always invites interpretation. Silence is rarely empty. In stories involving powerful figures, it often speaks louder than any statement. And as the public fixated on timelines, decisions, and unexplained intersections, the silence surrounding Musk and Zillus became its own kind of catalyst. Not because silence implies guilt, not because silence hides anything, but because silence leaves room vast, echoing room for imagination. When public curiosity reaches a boiling point, any absence of explanation becomes an invitation. People begin listening not to what is said, but to what isn't. They read between the lines. They project their own interpretations onto the blank spaces. And soon, those blank spaces grow more compelling than the facts themselves. In this case, the silence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was simply professional, private, controlled. The kind of silence that surrounds high-stakes work, sensitive technology, and lives lived under relentless public scrutiny. But to the observers who were already piecing together patterns, it felt like a curtain that refused to lift. And behind that curtain they imagined meaning. Commentators on social platforms insisted that the lack of clarification held the real story. Analysts studied corporate hierarchies as if they were topographical maps of hidden terrain. Speculators treated their interpretations like evidence, not realizing how easily curiosity can masquerade as certainty. As the silence deepened, the narrative shifted from timeline analysis to psychological projection. People began asking not just what happened, but why. Not just when they intersected professionally, but how those intersections were perceived by the world. The truth remained unchanged, unconfirmed, unelaborated, untouched. Yet the silence surrounding it created the illusion of unanswered questions. And unanswered questions create a gravitational pull that few stories can escape. And this pull was growing stronger. Because in the absence of official explanations, the public turned to the next best thing, emotional interpretation. Theories stopped being about dates and started being about motives. Motives became speculation. Speculation became narrative. And narrative became truth in the minds of those who needed the story to make sense. But stories built from silence are fragile. They are easily broken when new context appears, context the public never considered, yet desperately needed. And that context was coming, quietly, inevitably, ready to realign everything the world thought it understood. Every mystery eventually reaches a point where the public realizes they've been looking in the wrong direction. And in this story, that turning point emerged, not from revelation, but from context. Context that had always been there, hidden in plain sight, overlooked, or misunderstood. Because when people become fixated on a single unanswered question, they stop seeing the larger landscape that surrounds it. They stop noticing the forces, pressures, and responsibilities shaping the individuals at the center of the narrative. And without that bigger picture, speculation becomes a distorted mirror, reflecting not truth, but obsession. To understand why their timelines intersected so tightly, the world needed to step back and look at the scale of the stage they were operating on. This wasn't a story about two people. It was a story about technology reshaping civilization. A story about systems so advanced, so delicate, and so consequential that only a handful of minds on the planet could guide them. Elon Musk was steering multiple revolutions at once: spaceflight, renewable energy, AI research. Every choice he made had global repercussions. Every alliance mattered. Every expert he trusted became part of the machinery pushing humanity forward or protecting it from risk. Siobhan Zilis was operating in a parallel crucible. She wasn't a public figure. She was a strategist, a technologist, someone whose work lived behind the surface layer of announcements and headlines. Her decisions were measured not in popularity, but in long-term outcomes, stability, and safety. When viewed through this lens, their alignment looked less mysterious and more inevitable, not personal, not symbolic, but strategic. The deeper the public looked, the clearer it became that their convergence wasn't an anomaly, it was a reflection of the world they were trying to build or safeguard. But context can be unsettling. It strips away the glamour of mystery. It replaces shadows with structure. And sometimes, people don't want structure, they want intrigue. Yet even as the larger context became harder to ignore, there remained one detail, one unanswered element, that kept the theories alive. A detail that refused to dissolve in logic. A detail that made the public ask, if everything was purely professional, why did the story still feel unfinished? That question lingered in the air like static electricity, refusing to settle. And it was that lingering uncertainty that would push the narrative toward its most intense chapter yet. Some stories refuse to settle, even when the logic is clear and the evidence points nowhere dramatic. They linger, unresolved, not because a hidden truth exists, but because the human mind is wired to search for patterns, motives, and meaning in places where none may actually be hiding. And this story was no different. Even with context clarifying their shared professional mission, even with timelines explained by the colossal scale of the work they were pursuing, even with the understanding that proximity doesn't imply anything beyond collaboration, people still felt something was missing, not because something was missing, but because the puzzle had conditioned them to expect a final piece. Human psychology rebels against loose ends. When a narrative lacks resolution, the imagination fills the gaps with its own inventions. And so, the more the public tried to solve the Musk-Zilis timeline, the more the absence of a dramatic conclusion became a conclusion of its own. Theories shifted, softened, grew more abstract. Some claimed the truth was buried in future plans not yet revealed. Others argued the story's significance lay in strategic implications, not personal ones. A few insisted the intrigue itself was the real phenomenon, not the people involved. In a way, the public's persistence said more about society than about either of them. We live in a world hungry for spectacle. A world trained to expect a twist. A world uncomfortable with the idea that sometimes there isn't one. But as the curiosity spiraled, another force began to surface, one the public rarely considers: the weight of attention. Every theory adds pressure. Every thread tightens the narrative. Every unanswered question becomes a spotlight, bright, relentless, uninvited. And for individuals working in fields as volatile and high-stakes as artificial intelligence, that spotlight becomes more than a nuisance. It becomes a distortion. Because when the world turns a professional alignment into a mystery, it risks obscuring the work itself, the breakthroughs, the responsibilities, the enormous consequences tied to their decisions. Yet the fascination persisted. The story kept stretching, twisting, expanding, not because new details emerged, but because the lack of definitive closure kept the loops of curiosity alive. And then something subtle began to happen. Attention didn't fade. Speculation didn't collapse. Instead, the narrative started accelerating, pushing toward a deeper question, a more existential one. If the facts remain ordinary, why does the story feel extraordinary? And that question would open the door to the next shift, the moment when the mystery stopped being about them and started being about us. At a certain point, every unresolved story transforms. It stops being about the individuals at its center and becomes a reflection of the people trying to decipher it. This is the mirror effect, the moment when speculation reveals more about the audience than the subject. And as the Musk-Zilis narrative continued to circulate, morph, and intensify, this mirror grew clearer, sharper, almost uncomfortable to look into. Why did a simple convergence of professional timelines spark such fascination? Why did the absence of dramatic revelation feel suspicious to so many? Why did questions persist long after the answers proved elusive or incomplete? The truth lies in a deeper psychological instinct. Humans are drawn to ambiguity like moths to flame. Ambiguity offers possibility. Possibility invites imagination. Imagination blurs into belief. And so, piece by piece, the public began constructing a story that didn't originate from confirmed details, but from their own projections, expectations, and emotional needs. In the narrative people built, Musk became the symbol of volatility, someone whose life, decisions, and ambitions appear grand, unpredictable, larger than reason. Zillis became the counterweight, precise, intelligent, enigmatic, carrying an aura of intentional quiet that the public rarely sees in high-level innovators. Together, they formed a contrast people couldn't resist analyzing, not because it revealed truth, but because it created tension, and tension is addictive. The more people searched, the more they believed they were on the edge of uncovering something concealed. Even when no new information surfaced, the illusion of proximity to a hidden truth kept the narrative alive. But the mirror effect went deeper still. The world is thirsty for stories of genius, ambition, and the human complexities behind powerful minds. When real life fails to provide those tales, people build them themselves, layering drama onto the mundane, mystery onto the ordinary, significance onto coincidence. In that sense, the public's fixation wasn't really about Musk or Zillis. It was about the audience's own desire for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic. Their story became a canvas onto which people painted their own fears, hopes, theories, and fantasies. It became an outlet for curiosity, a puzzle with no answer, a mystery kept alive by human imagination rather than hidden facts. But the deeper the mirror effect grew, the more distorted the reflections became. Speculation morphed into narrative. Narrative morphed into belief. Belief morphed into certainty, unsupported, yet passionately defended. And when certainty is built on illusion, it can lead the public into dangerous territory. Because once people believe a story exists, they begin searching for a climax, even if they have to invent one. And that search would push this narrative toward its most fragile breaking point. Every story that thrives on speculation eventually reaches a tipping point, a place where fascination meets obsession, and where curiosity can either illuminate or consume. By this stage, the Musk-Zillis narrative had moved beyond timelines, dates, and professional intersections. It existed in a fragile space between reality and imagination. The edge is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It begins with questions that linger too long. It grows through theories repeated as fact. It accelerates when silence meets projection. And eventually, it transforms into something that feels urgent, even personal, to anyone paying attention. On that fragile edge, the story stops being about understanding the truth. Instead, it becomes about maintaining the tension. Every uncovered detail is magnified. Every coincidence becomes a clue. Every gap in knowledge feels like a secret waiting to be exposed. The internet thrives here. Threads stretch endlessly. Timelines are reconstructed and reinterpreted. Videos promise revelations that never arrive. All of it feeds the illusion that answers are close, just one post, one document, one overlooked timestamp away. And yet, the truth is always more elusive than the story. Behind the screen, behind the speculation, the real work continued. AI strategies, company growth, technological innovation, none of it paused for narrative, none of it catered to obsession. And yet, the public had woven a tapestry of suspense and intrigue that no factual update could unravel. On the edge, psychology and reality collide. People begin to read intent where there is only coincidence. They attribute meaning where there is only timing. They see relationships that may exist only in perception, not in action. And that is where danger lives, not in facts, but in the stories we tell ourselves when facts are scarce. Because once the audience believes there is a climax, the mind demands it. Every mystery needs resolution, every tension needs release. And when life does not provide one, imagination will. The narrative had grown larger than the events themselves. It had taken on a life of its own, thriving in the spaces between known and unknown, between timing and significance, between what is real and what feels inevitable. And as it hovered on that fragile edge, the next chapter of the story would confront the deepest question of all: what do we hope to find when we peer into the shadows? All mysteries reach a point where curiosity becomes reflection, where questions shift from what happened to why do we care? And for the story surrounding Musk and Zillis, that moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but with a weight that no observer could ignore. The shadows of speculation had stretched long across timelines, dates, and decisions. They had cast doubts, sparked theories, and invited obsession. Yet within those shadows, one question lingered above all others. What does it mean when the ordinary appears extraordinary? The public had watched professional intersections, followed timelines, and pieced together the echoes of decisions made in boardrooms or private offices. They had tracked names, dates, and initiatives, but no statement, no revelation, no confirmation ever landed. And yet, the story never lost momentum, because the fascination wasn't with the facts themselves. It was with the human need to find narrative in uncertainty. We crave meaning, we crave connection, we crave drama, and when life presents only fragments, we construct the rest. We assign intention. We speculate motives. We imagine relationships. Not because reality demands it, but because our minds do. And in that act of projection, the shadows become more vivid than the truth. The story we tell ourselves becomes richer, darker, more compelling than anything that may have truly occurred. For Musk and Zillis, the public gaze transformed their professional alignment into something mythic. The timelines, the proximity, the silence, all were amplified into suspense. And yet, none of it could capture the reality of complex work, of responsibility, of personal choice. Reality is rarely cinematic. Reality rarely fits neatly into the loops of curiosity the world constructs. Still, the story persists, not in newspapers, press releases, or filings, but in the collective imagination. It persists because the human mind is drawn to patterns, to tension, to the unknown. And sometimes, the most enduring stories are those that never fully resolve. In the end, perhaps the point isn't to uncover the truth, but to examine why we search for it, why we follow timelines that refuse clarity, why we peer into shadows that never yield answers, why we insist on narratives where only ambiguity exists. And in that reflection, the mystery becomes something larger, a mirror not of the people involved, but of ourselves. Because every fascination tells us as much about who is watching as it does about what is watched. The question in the shadows is not about them. It is about us, and what we are willing to imagine in the absence of certainty.